Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. First of all, let me begin by saying I'm very, very pleased to be here with you. I have traveled to New York City far too many times to try to even begin to count on human rights related issues, but I consider this to be one of the most important issues that I've traveled to New York City for. I'm based in the Washington, D.C. metro area. This issue of Zionism is one that has beguiled me, for lack of a better description, for a long time. My introduction to this issue on a deep level occurred back in the early 80s with the siege on Lebanon, more specifically the massacres that took place in Sabra and Shatila. I ended up writing a poem that I'd like to begin with, a poem simply entitled Israel, O Israel. A nation of people born from injustice, causing great sorrow in all civilized among us. You claim your only concern to be your security, but your true intent is plain enough for everyone to see. There are Jews among you who detest what you do, but their voices are muffled and they seem to be few. You're proud and you're arrogant, malicious and clever. You seem to think world sympathy is going to shield you forever. Oh, but the bed is too short and the covers are too narrow. You can't see the handwriting, for your scope is too narrow. Aggressive you've been since the day you were born, from the anguish and misery of lives you have torn. Israel, O Israel, where will you be when the pages have dried on your history? So that was written right after the siege on Lebanon, the massacres. And what is so tragic is that these words could have been easily written today, because the only thing that has changed is that the insanity has just deepened, and largely because of the kind of support that that Zionist apartheid state receives from my own country, that likes to project itself around the world as the land of liberty and justice for all. Let me also note in my introductory comments that I always strive to make a distinction between Zionism and Judaism. I was an admirer of the late Dr. Alfred Lilienthal, and I truly love one of his quotes that I would like to share with you now. He said, "Zionism is not Judaism, and Judaism is not Zionism. And to be anti-Zionist is in no way to be anti-Semitic. Zionism is a political movement devoted to the founding and advancement of the State of Israel, politically, diplomatically, financially, and otherwise. On the other hand, Judaism is a religious faith, a relationship between man and God, requiring no political loyalty to any country. Too often religion and nationalism have become mixed up." End quote. Very beautiful and on point quote from the late Dr. Alfred Lilienthal to lay the foundation for what I'm going to share with you. And let me also note, it's going to probably come as a surprise, the primary substance that my presentation will be in the form of because it's actually stemming from an article that I read today. In fact, I didn't even get to read it in its entirety. It's a very long piece. I read about half of it, made my own little commentaries and parentheses at different points in it, and I just thought that this would be an ideal mode of presentation on this topic of Zionism and the state of Israel in Africa. Again, this was written by an insider, by a Zionist insider. It's titled "The Evolution of Israel's Africa Policy," and it's coming from the JewishVirtualLibrary.org. Fascinating read. Long before the state of Israel was established, the father of modern political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, had looked to Africa and recognized parallels between the black and Jewish experiences. In his book, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Altneulen, published in 1902, just 5 years after the Zionist conference in Basel formally initiated the drive for a Jewish state, Herzl wrote that, quote, "Once I have witnessed the redemption of the Jews, my people, I wish also to assist in the redemption of the Africans," end quote. Almost immediately after the redemption of the Jewish people, Herzl's interest in helping the Africans was taken up by the leaders of Israel. Their idealistic and egalitarian attitude toward Africa was typified by the architect of Israel's Africa policy, Golda Meir, who believed that the lessons learned by Israelis could be passed on to Africans who, particularly during the 1950s, were engaged in the same process of nation building. Quote, "Like them," she said, "we had shaken off foreign rule. Like them, we had to learn for ourselves how to reclaim the land, how to increase the yields of our crops, how to irrigate, how to raise poultry, how to live together, and how to defend ourselves," end quote. Israel could provide a better model for a newly independent African state, Meir believed, because Israelis had been forced, quote, this is a quote, had been forced to find solutions to the kinds of problems that large, wealthy, powerful states had never encountered, end quote. While there is no doubt that Israeli leaders have always had philanthropic attitudes toward Africa, their primary interest in the continent rested on the more tangible grounds of realpolitik. Just as Africa was the scene of a battle of influence among the superpowers, so too has it been a battlefield between Israel and the Arabs. The battlefield was particularly important during, and on this note, this battlefield between the Israel and the Arabs, there's a quote that I'm going to share with you from former National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski that you will find no doubt very interesting. This battlefield was particularly important during Israel's first 2 decades because the United States had not yet proven itself a reliable ally, for that matter, nor for that matter had the Soviet Union proven itself as the guarantor of its clients in the Arab world. Thus, it was not necessarily hyperbole when Dan Avni, the deputy director of the Africa Department of Israel's Foreign Ministry, described the struggle in Africa as, quote, "a fight of life and death for us," end quote. Thus, even small African nations like Togo became pawns in the effort to obtain an advantage on the continent. Now, that the U.S. and this is my perspective, that now that the U.S. is solidly and shamefully ensconced within the Zionist column, philanthropic pretensions, to use the description here, are no longer necessary. Although Mauri, getting back to the article, although Mauri denied that realpolitik was Israel's primary motive, Israeli concern for nations like Togo rested largely on the fact that their votes at the United Nations General Assembly counted equally with those of the United States or Russia. Since Israel already faced a large hostile voting bloc from the Arab and Muslim states, it was important for Israel to try to win as many African votes as possible if it was to have any hope of avoiding constant censure in the General Assembly. And I should note here parenthetically that the state of Israel, to my knowledge, has been the most censured country in the UN, despite the UN's toothless history on this unfortunate crisis in the Middle East. From the perspective of the African states, however, it made less sense to side with Israel than with the Arab states, because the latter bloc votes were needed in international forums like the United Nations to exert pressure on the major powers to protect their own interests. Israel has only one vote in the UN and is not represented in the Organization for African Unity, whereas the Arabs have 18 members in the UN and 6 in the OAU. Now I read somewhere recently, about maybe a month ago, that the state of Israel was petitioning the OAU for status. I don't know where that is, but I would not be surprised if they end up getting it. After 1967, the Arab states also enjoyed a propaganda advantage in Africa because of Israel's occupation of Arab territories, which was seen by Africans as a possible precedent for the expansion of South Africa or Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. The Africans were also less frightened by Arab designs after the death of Egyptian President Gamal Nasser, because his successor, Anwar Sadat, was far less interested in Pan-Arabism, the movement to unite the Arab world, which was perceived as a threat to African independence. The issue of South Africa and apartheid actually provided a good example of Israel's priorities in Africa. In denouncing apartheid for the first time in the early 1960s, despite the presence of a very large South African Jewish community, Israel risked its relations with a country that had been friendly. There is no question that Israel found the apartheid system abhorrent. Can you believe those words? But its condemnation was also meant to attract support from the more numerous black African states. It was not until the 1970s, after the black African states severed their ties with Israel, that Israeli-South African relations became close, but reports exaggerated the degree of closeness. Now let me say this parenthetically. The uncomfortable truths behind this patently false assertion represents an Achilles heel for Zionist Israel in the annals of modern-day African history. Apartheid South Africa and Zionist Israel were like Siamese twins on the international bloc. Israel not only aided apartheid South Africa in practically every facet of its brutal oppression of black South Africa, but it also made it possible for South Africa to become the first nuclear power on the continent. And far from abhorring the evils of South African apartheid, Israel has been successful in constructing an oppressive system that is far, far worse. Getting back to the article. No Israeli policy sufficed to offset the image that her enemies presented to the Africans, that Israel was a nation of white Europeans who had expelled more than 1 million people from their homeland in furtherance of imperialist efforts to retain a foothold in the Middle East. As an African state which shared the Muslim religion with much of the continent, Egypt held a major advantage in its competition with Israel prior to the 1979 peace treaty. Quote, "The people of Africa will continue to look up to us, who guard the northern gate of the continent, and who are its connecting link with the world outside," Nasser wrote. "We cannot under any condition," he added, "relinquish our responsibility in helping in every way possible in diffusing the light of civilization into the farthest parts of that virgin jungle," end quote. Now, to be honest, this is me again, parenthetically speaking. To be honest, this quote attributed to Nasser has the ring of an Arab colonial mindset vis-a-vis Africa south of the Sahara. But that's another argument for another time. Let it suffice to say for this presentation that the late Gamal Abdel Nasser was more Arab nationalist than he was Muslim. Egypt tried to use its geographical advantage to extract political condemnation of Israel from the African states at every opportunity. But with the exception of the Asian African Conference at Bandung in April of 1955, had little success. The reason for this, Michael Brecher has suggested, is that, quote, "there was no emotional disposition to favor the Arab cause. Some Africans had no contact with either Jew or Arab, while those who knew the Arabs recalled the slave trade above all," end quote. Indeed, he goes on to note, quote, "for many Africans, Israelis were Europeans, but this was not automatically a symbol of derision, as it was for many Asians," end quote. Now, I noted parenthetically here, Arabs, Islam, and the slave trade is a much misunderstood and manipulated phenomenon within the black African mind. All nations, tribes, and cultures practiced slavery at different points in history. In fact, the word slave itself has a white origin, according to the late J.A. Rogers. It comes from the word Slav, a Germanic people who were reduced to slavery by the Romans. History suggests that of all slave-making systems, the European slave trade was the most oppressive and dehumanizing of them all. Getting back to the article, the Bandung Conference had a tremendous impact on Israel, however, because the fact that Israel had not even been invited indicated that after 7 years, the nation was still isolated in its own region. To combat this isolation, Israel sought to establish diplomatic relations with African states and to offer them aid. Unlike the aid from the superpowers, Israel's came without strings attached. Yeah, right. Not so much because it did not hope to obtain support in exchange, but because it was in no position to demand it. In addition, Israel feared that if it failed to give aid, then Egypt would step in and fill the vacuum. Quote, "Our aid to the new countries," Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion told the Knesset in 1960, "is not a matter of philanthropy. We are no less in need of the fraternity of friendship of the new nations than they are of our assistance," end quote. Now, parenthetically, to say Israel's aid came without strings attached is extremely duplicitous. And this duplicity was recognized during that time. In the September 1964 edition of the Egyptian Gazette, El-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, aka Malcolm X, was quoted as follows, quote, "The number one weapon of 20th century imperialism is Zionist dollarism. And one of the main bases for this weapon is Zionist Israel. The ever-scheming European imperialists is wisely placed Israel where she could geographically divide the Arab world, infiltrate and sow the seeds of dissension among African leaders, and also divide Africans against the Asians. In short, the Zionist argument to justify Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine has no intelligent or legal basis in history, not even in their own religion. Where is their Messiah? End quote. It is also worth noting the observation made by former U.S. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski in a formerly classified memorandum or white paper issued by the National Security Council on March 17, 1978. A revealing excerpt reads as follows, quote, "We must envisage," and this is a very, very, very important quote that I'm about to share with you from the former National Security Advisor from the Carter administration. He said, "We must envisage the possibility, however remote, that Black Americans interested in African affairs may refocus their attention on the Arab-Israeli conflict, taking into account the African descent of American blacks. It is reasonable to anticipate their sympathies would lie with the Arabs, who are closer to them in spirit and, in some cases, related to them by blood. Black involvement in lobbying to support the Arabs may lead to serious dissension between American blacks and Jews." End quote. That is a very revealing quote. That was part of this, at the time it was drafted, top secret classified white paper.
What was the last line in that again?
Black involvement in lobbying to support the Arabs may lead to serious dissension between American blacks and Jews. And, you know, and this is what happened. And in fact, it's quite interesting to note that not long after these words were written in that secret memorandum, the anti-apartheid movement in the United States, along with a rise in consciousness and resistance against apartheid in occupied Palestine, significantly increased. And so, you know, they, as these experts are wont to do, they had their finger on the pulse. They knew exactly where things were heading, and the purpose of this paper was to try to head it off. Getting back to the article. The labor and socialist movements in Israel made the first contacts with the Africans, and in 1958, Israel's Labor Federation inaugurated Israel's formal instructional program with an international seminar in cooperation. The first Israeli embassy in Africa, only its 8th overall, was opened in Accra, Ghana, in November 1956. 2 years later, Golda Meir made a 5-week trip to Africa and had the first high-level discussions with African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, William Tubman, and Felix Houphouët Boigny. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. That helped to show Israeli interest in the African liberation movements, as well as to stimulate African interest in Israel. Trade with Africa has always been one-sided, since Israel's major imports, such as oil and grain, are for the most part not available from that continent. Consequently, the aid that Israel provided its African friends was of greater value than the economic advantages it reaped. As noted above, however, Israel was more interested in political than economic advantages. One of Israel's main contributions to Africa was military aid, and it remains that way to this day. And one could just say for better or worse, but we know that it's been for the worse, which was provided in the form of conventional and paramilitary training and to a lesser extent by the sale of arms. By 1966, 10 African states had received some direct military assistance from Israel, and in each case, the aid was provided to individuals who were either influential or potentially influential. For example, Israel trained Mobutu Sese Seko, the general of the Congolese army, who 2 years later became the nation's president with Israel's help. And an oppressive president he was. This is me speaking now, with Zionist Israel's aid. The Arab League continued to pressure the Africans to expel Israeli advisors and technicians and to recognize the threat that Israel represented. Quote, "The danger lurks under the glittering surface of trade and aid offered by Israel to some emerging states during the last few years," a League statement said in 1963. Tel Aviv's offers have been in reality a facade for neocolonialism, trying to sneak into Africa through a back window after the old, well-known colonialism had been driven out through the front door, end quote. African leaders viewed Israel's efforts differently. For example, during the 1962 visit to Israel, President Deco of the Central African Republic remarked, quote, and again, this was on his visit to the state of Israel, quote, "You have not tried to create us in your image. Instead, Israel has contented itself with showing the new African nations its achievements, in helping them overcome their weaknesses, in assisting them in learning. In so doing, you have conquered Black Africa," end quote. Just conquered the mind of this particular leader. This effort to conquer Africa by providing trade and aid is only one facet of Israel's strategy for obtaining an advantage in its conflict with the Arabs. A second aspect of Israel's policy involves a strategically located African country, Ethiopia, which the Israelis were already cultivating for all the reasons discussed above. In the 1950s, Israel hoped to form an alliance with the United States, but Secretary of State John Foster Dulles advised President Dwight Eisenhower against any formal agreement. Consequently, Israel began to look for other allies that might help encircle her enemies with a ring of friends. In late 1957 and 1958, Ben-Gurion sent agents to 3 non-Arab countries, Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia, to explore possibilities for an alliance. As non-Arab states were with long historical ties to the Jewish people and strategically important geographic locations, these nations were potentially valuable allies. In the case of Ethiopia, the nation is located in the Horn of Africa and has a coastline along the Red Sea. The approach to Ethiopia was made after the Suez War and the Gulf of Aqaba had been recognized as an international waterway. Hence, Israel saw Ethiopia's port as a gateway not only to Ethiopia, but to the rest of Africa. In addition, as a predominantly Christian nation, Ethiopia is, along with Israel, the only non-Muslim riparian state, and therefore a deterrent to Arab efforts to make the Red Sea either an Arab or an Islamic lake. When Egypt blockaded the Straits of Tiran in 1956, it became particularly clear to Israel's leaders that it was necessary to have a friend on the Red Sea coast in order to avert any future blockades. That waterway would become progressively more important as the amount of Persian Gulf oil moving to Israel from its new friend in Iran, this was during the time of the Shah of Iran, increased. It became even more significant in the 1970s after the Suez Canal reopened and traffic resumed between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. In addition to Ethiopia's strategic location, Israel believed that Ethiopia's stability was a key to the stability of the Horn of Africa, and that it was in Israel's interest to prevent Ethiopia's subversion by Egypt or Saudi Arabia. The most overt threat to Ethiopia came from Somalia, which Israel had also approached in the hope of establishing diplomatic ties, and by which it had been consistently rebuffed. That predominantly Muslim country, moreover, joined the Arab League, thereby convincing Israel of the need to solidify its relationship with Ethiopia. From Ethiopia's perspective, the alliance with Israel was also advantageous, since the late 1950s was the period of Nasser's greatest influence and hence most threatening to Ethiopia. There were also long historical ties between Ethiopia and the Jewish people, and personal ties between Emperor Haile Selassie and not only the Jewish people but also Palestine. Haile Selassie considered himself the Lion of Judah, a direct descendant of the Jewish people. Moreover, after the Italian conquest of Ethiopia in 1936, Haile Selassie and his family, as well as many other Ethiopians, spent part of their time in exile in Jerusalem. 6 years later, when he returned to Ethiopia, the emperor established the first modern links with the Jews of Palestine. The first Israeli delegation arrived in Ethiopia in 1955 for the celebration of the Emperor's Silver Jubilee. Now, I'm going to stop there with this read, but I want to encourage everyone here to access that article.
What is the name of the guy?
Well, there is no.
All right, it's just the Jewish library.
Yeah. It's the Jewish Virtual Library.org.
It's a good source.
Yeah, the Evolution of Israel's Africa Policy is the name of the piece, and I read about half of it. Let me conclude my remarks with this. In addition to that poem that I shared at the beginning, these three books I'm holding in my hands, they reflect the deep connection that we have with this issue of Zionist Israel and its occupation of Palestine. The Palestinians' Holocaust, American Perspectives. Unfortunately, all three of these books are now out of print. But the Palestinians' Holocaust, American Perspectives, Volume 1. The Message of Rachel Corrie, that young American 23-year-old, gifted, deeply committed, exceptionally spirited American, that on her very first visit to the part of the world that is ironically referred to as the Holy Land, lost her life while trying to prevent the destruction of a Palestinian family's home in the Rafah refugee camp. She was just 23 years of age. And this book, Target Sudan, What's Really Behind the Crisis in Darfur. There's a chapter in this book, and there's an interesting story behind it. There's a chapter in this book. See if I can find the title of it real quick. The author is Mauri Saalakhan.
And the other two books?
I'm the principal author of the other two as well. That's, you know, this part of the education side of our human rights work. Oh my goodness, there's a chapter here, or one of the sub-chapters, having to do with Israel's involvement in that, or the Zionism's involvement in that whole crisis. But the interesting story in this book and how this book came into existence, I was approached by one of the Zionist founders of what was called the Save Darfur Coalition. Anyone here remember that coalition, the Save Darfur coalition? At the height of the crisis in Darfur, there were a lot of organizations that ended up being persuaded to sign on and become a part of that coalition effort that whose principal objective was, number one, to label what was taking place in Darfur as a genocide, which it wasn't. It wasn't a genocide. The Arab, Sudanese trying to kill off the African Sudanese, when if you had a group of Arabs and Africans in a group together, you would not be able to look at them and determine who is who, because they look the same. The only thing that distinguishes one from the other is the Arabs were able to speak with an Arab tongue. That's it. That's it. And one of the other ironies was that many of the Africans, quote unquote, members of the African tribes that were fleeing the violence in South Sudan, they were fleeing into Khartoum and finding refuge in Khartoum, the capital of the Sudan. But anyway, I was approached. I was approached by one of the principals within the Save Darfur coalition, because I was this fairly well-known human rights activist in the Washington area, and they felt that if they could win me over, they could, score another significant ally in advancing their agenda. And this was an agenda that was pushed, as I saw it, by Zionists and by ultra right-wing evangelicals. They were the ones that were pushing it. And they did win quite a number of African American leaders over to their side. When they approached me, and I was approached and basically made the offer that if I became a part of the campaign, if I could write a book, because by this time I had written a number of books, that if I could write a book about the crisis and write it from that perspective, that this is a genocide taking place, it would guarantee it would be a bestseller, it would do very well, and I could do very well financially. I began to examine, it piqued my interest, just me being approached in that manner. And so I began to do more independent research on the crisis, and I came to a realization that it was not as it was being depicted in the mainstream press and within political circles. And then I ended up taking the exact opposite position than the one that they wanted me to take. We ended up publishing this book, Target Sudan, What's Really Behind the Crisis in Darfur. And that's when my the distaste or the dislike for Mauri Saalakhan reached a whole nother level within certain circles. But I just want to, I'll end with this. I applaud you. I thank you for organizing this, Marcia, and the others who worked with her to pull this together. It's a very, very important issue. It's a very sensitive issue, and it's also one that carries a certain amount of risk. given all of the undercover promotion that took place around it. I think if we had really thrown it out there, and in terms of promotion, this space would have, we got a nice crowd here now, but the space would have been probably full to the hilt. But we would have also had some of our friends who would not be here to mean us well as well. So I'll stop there and just look forward to the discussion to follow. And again, I've come to know Gilad by reputation. It is my honor to now meet you face to face and to share this space with you. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you.